My name is Dawn Kurth, and I'm a LiveGirl board member and the founder of No Kidding Nutrition, which is a wellness company that helps people build better habits. I'm also the proud parent of 2 young adults, one of them with me here today, my daughter Phoebe.
Hi, my name is Phoebe. I'm currently a senior at St. Luke's School here in New Canaan. I'm going to be attending Villanova and majoring in business this coming fall. And I am currently a lacrosse captain for my lacrosse team and also a competitive ski racer.
Wow. So we are joined here today as part of Women's History Month with author Marie Benedict to discuss her best-selling book, The Only Woman in the Room, a story about Hedy Lamarr, the actress/inventor. Marie is a lawyer with more than 10 years experience as a litigator at 2 of the country's top premier law firms, who found her calling unearthing the hidden historical stories of women. Her mission is to excavate from the past the most important, complex, and fascinating women of history and bring them into the light of the present day, where we can finally perceive the breadth of their contributions, as well as the insights they bring to modern day issues. Marie has written a series of historical novels, beginning with The Other Einstein, which tells the tale of Albert Einstein's wife and the role she might have played in his theories. This was followed by the USA Today bestselling Carnegie's Maid in 2018, and then The Only Woman in the Room in 2019, which became a New York Times bestseller. Her latest book, Lady Clementine, was released earlier this year. Welcome, Marie, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Gosh, in this crazy world, it's so nice to be able to have a conversation and focus on things that we can control, which is the role that we are all playing out there today and the historical impact that that's ultimately going to have. So thank you. And I love the mission that your organization has to sort of empower and educate young girls and young women to become future leaders. I think that's obviously right up my alley and super, super important. Such a natural tie-in with what I'm trying to do, which is, as you mentioned, bringing out the stories of these historical women who did make important contributions, who were leaders, but whose stories we really don't know.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you.
We're excited to have you here. I know you wanted to talk for a few minutes, but before you begin, I just wanted to let our listeners know that if you want to ask a question, anything regarding the book or Marie's background, please use the chat button, which is at the bottom of the screen along the lower bar. And we'll use that, and those questions will pop up, and we will start answering them. Marie will be talking for a few minutes, and then we'll start the Q&A, but please use the chat button. Okay, thanks everyone.
Awesome. So I thought today, since we're, you guys are all over, I know we have a wide variety of listeners of a variety of ages, but the organization's focus is sort of harnessing the power and the interests and passions of young women and young girls. So I thought I'd take a couple minutes before I talk about the book specifically to discuss how I ended up doing what I do. And the reason I like to talk about it when I talk to audiences of your sort of age and background and missions is because my path actually began when I was about your age, in middle school and high school. It was a long and circuitous path. It took me a long time to find my calling and find out what I was really meant to do. But this is sort of how it started. When I was a young girl, elementary school, middle school, I was like that crazy, voracious reader girl, the one who always had a stack of books with her. And I had this incredible aunt who was, she was an English professor. She was a poet herself. And she's not with us anymore, but she'd be totally cool with me calling her a rebellious nun, because she was rebellious in her own way. And it was really her job to keep me outfitted in books, right? I was the oldest of 6 kids, and somebody had to have that job, and my mother really couldn't do it. So she kind of fed me this steady diet of incredible literature, things that nobody my age was reading. She was really trying to find things that were age appropriate, but also reading level appropriate. And when I was in late middle school, I think it was, she gave me a gift for Christmas one year of this book that really started me on the path that I'm on today. And that book was called The Mists of Avalon. It was by Marion Zimmer Bradley. Not a ton of people today have read it, but it was really groundbreaking for its time. It was the story it was a female-centric retelling of the legend of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. So instead of Arthur and Lancelot and their swashbuckling quest for the Grail, we had his wife Guinevere and his sister Morgan Le Fay, and the story was the same, but it was told from the perspective of the women. And it opened up my eyes to the fact that there were strong, powerful stories, powerful voices of women lurking, kind of hiding in history and legend and myth that weren't part of what we had been taught and told. And it sort of started me on this path, this quest of my own to kind of find these women and preserve, perpetuate, and share their stories. So when I went to college, which you're about to embark on, Phoebe, I went to Boston College undergrad, and I became a history major, and I thought I'd become a history professor or an archaeologist, kind of excavating these women's voices and stories from the past. But when I was in college, if you were a history major, the number one question you got asked was, what the heck are you going to do with that major? So I kind of listened to the louder societal voices that suggested that maybe a history major would be better suited to going to law school. And there were a lot of women really being encouraged to go to law school at this time. So I listened to those voices, and I ended up becoming a lawyer in New York City for over a decade. I was a commercial litigator. But I knew it wasn't right. I knew it wasn't what I was meant to be doing. And so as the years progressed, that little voice whispering that I should be doing something different got louder and louder. And I started to take graduate classes at NYU and Columbia in history, thinking maybe I go back to become a history professor, which is sort of what I thought I'd start out doing. And it was only then that I started to dabble in the idea of exploring these women's stories and voices through fiction. And finally, when that voice started to get like crazy loud, I dove into actually writing these stories. And once I decided that this was what I was going to do instead of being a lawyer, which was a tough decision, I feel like I developed almost like, for lack of a better word, like an antenna for these women and their stories. I literally find them everywhere. These women are hiding in plain sight, waiting for us to find them and tell their stories. So just to take the first book in the series that you mentioned, Dawn, The Other Einstein, which you mentioned is the story of Albert Einstein's first wife, who was a physicist herself. And they met in university and ultimately became both romantic and work partners, and married during his most prolific period, which was 1905. It was called his miracle year, when 4 of the most groundbreaking theories in physics, really the theories that formed the foundation for modern physics, were published when they were married. And once I sort of found out about her through a children's biography of Albert Einstein that I was reading with one of my sons. I have an 11 and a 14-year-old, and one of them's a science kid. And as I was reading this biography, there were like 2 sentences about this woman he went to university with, who was also in a physics program. And that antenna that I described started to go like crazy. Like, what are the odds that a woman in the 1890s, number one, would be in university, rare, would be in a physics program, rarer still, and would be in a physics program with Albert Einstein, and we'd never heard of him? And what are the odds that she had nothing to do with his work? So that antenna kind of went crazy. And when I actually did the research into her life, she was so much more important, both to physics overall, but just important in her own right, not only because she was part of Albert Einstein's story. Her story of this sort of meteoric rise she made from the backwater of 19th century Serbia, where it was illegal for girls to go to high school, to become one of the very first women in a university physics program, I felt was a story that was deserving of being told unto itself. But how did I kind of find Hedy Lamarr, right? The woman who's at the core of the story I'm going to talk more about today. Well, I had heard of Hedy Lamarr. I knew her name, but it wasn't until a really good friend of mine who's also an anthropologist and kind of collects these interesting nuggets about women. We were at lunch one day, and she mentioned this golden age of Hollywood actress who was also an inventor. And I added her to my list. I'd already was starting to write the Other Einstein and Carnegie's Maid at this time. And I added her to my list of women, historical women, that I thought I would, consider pursuing as a book topic. And this list is like, it's like a Santa Claus wish list. It's super long. And if any of you have any ideas for women, let me know. I often get great ideas from readers. But she told me about Hedy Lamarr and that she was an inventor, and I added her to my list. And then one day while I was still writing Carnegie's Maid, I kind of dipped into the research about Hedy Lamarr. And what I found when I really dug, not into the story about Hedy Lamarr, the actress, Hedy Lamarr, sort of this golden age of Hollywood starlet and stuff of gossip columns, you know, I found this incredible story of a woman who was really a Jewish refugee in many ways, and a really gifted scientist. But the thing that really turned me towards writing her story was the fact that every day, all of us are using basically an invention that she made. And that's what we're using today for our Zoom talk. It's what we use every day for our phones. It's Wi-Fi. The invention that she made during the 1930s that she was hoping, you know, would become this, this powerful weapon against the Nazis, over many iterations and decades, ultimately became Wi-Fi. It was a really groundbreaking thing. So once I knew that literally every single one of us in the world, most of us anyway, use her invention every single day, I knew that hers was the story that I really needed to tell next. So I thought I'd talk a little bit. I know most of your listeners have probably read the book. I thought I'd maybe talk a little bit about her story, and then we can delve into the questions if that works.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So I know that most of you have probably read the book, but for those of you who haven't, this path that led this woman who became Hedy Lamarr to create this invention was in many ways even more circuitous and long than my path to become from lawyer to writer. She started out not as Hedy Lamarr, but as a young teenager by the name of Hedwig Kiesler. She was a teenager in 1930s Vienna. She lived in an upscale Jewish neighborhood called Dobling. And this sort of insular community that she lived in, they were definitely part of the larger society of Vienna, but her family, her mother in particular, really had wanted her to follow the sort of straight and narrow path and become a hausfrau, marrying another nice boy from the community. But she was always, pardon the pun, headstrong. She was very smart, interested in science, interested in how the world around her worked, and also really interested in acting. In Europe at this time, you know, you're in a post-World War I period. Most of these countries have been hit economically. They're trying to establish themselves as independent forces. And one of the things that Vienna and Austria is really known for during this time is their theater world. They kind of pride themselves on it. And young Hedwig decides that she wants to plunge deep into this world of the theater and drama. She does it secretly at first because her parents want her to kind of follow the straight and narrow, but they finally do agree, and she appears in a film called Ecstasy, which is very scandalous for its time. She appears unclothed in it, which is very scandalous for the time. And her parents are not thrilled with this, and they make her promise to return only, to really use her talents only on the stage. And it's when she secures a role as Empress Elizabeth, which is a really coveted role, kind of in the Viennese equivalent of Broadway. In her opening night, a man spots her in the audience and really becomes enamored of her, pursues her. This man is much older than her. He's 36 to her 18, and he's the richest man in Austria. He owns this huge munitions manufacturing empire. And if you can imagine at this time period, we're in this post-World War I, sort of in between World War I and World War II time period. All around these countries are all trying to maintain their independence against all these rising fascist forces. To the north, Austria has Hitler in Germany. To the south, he has Mussolini in Italy. You've got Franco and Spain to the west, and they're trying to maintain their independence. But as part of that, had this man, Fritz Mandl, becomes an arms dealer first to Mussolini and then to Hitler. Hetty eventually courts this man, marries this man. Her parents initially really don't want her to, but then they believe that in some ways he might be able to protect her against the rise of fascism all around them, and in particular, the Nazi Party, which, as you know, is very anti-Semitic. So eventually they agree to let their daughter marry this man whose nickname was the Merchant of Death, not the ideal son-in-law. And she becomes sort of his wife hosting all these lavish parties and dinners and balls, which is where he does most of his business. So as she appears on his arm on all of these, all these different social occasions, she is hearing up close and personal all the secrets of World War II, long before anybody else does. You know, she's beautiful at this time period. The way that society viewed women wasn't very favorable. They felt like they could talk freely in front of her, because what could a beautiful woman understand about military strategy, weapons developments, and the plans for the Jewish people? And these are all the secrets of World War II that she's hearing on her husband's arm from Mussolini himself, Mussolini's men, and then eventually the Nazis. Obviously, this is not a situation she wants to stay in. She can see the writing on the wall with the Nazis want to overtake Austria and institute all their anti-Semitic plans. So she sort of fashions this crazy escape. I only depict 2 of them in the book, but actually she tries to escape 5 different times. I only really talk about 2 of them in the book, and she's eventually successful, but with each failed escape attempt, her husband becomes more abusive and more controlling. She's literally under lock and key. She has guards around her all the time, but she does, I don't want to give too many spoilers if you haven't read it, but she does fashion this crazy escape. And she makes her way through France to London, where she orchestrates a meeting with Louis B. Mayer, who was the head of MGM Studios, which was the most powerful and prominent film studio at the time. And through a series of machinations, she eventually secures a contract with him and sails to America with him. She starts out in Hollywood. After about a year of learning English, because she speaks 5 languages, but not English, and honing her acting skills, she lands her first role in a film that none of us have probably heard of today, but it's a film that turns her into an international star. But something else happens during that year that she's becoming famous in America, and of course, divorcing Fritz Mandel. The Anschluss happens. Austria takes over, Germany takes over Austria. And all of those secrets that she overheard, the Nazis' military plans, their weapons plans, and their plans for the Jewish people, immediately start to go into effect. The Jewish people start to become persecuted. The Nuremberg laws, which really strictly delineate how the Jewish people can operate in the world, those immediately go into effect. And Hetty starts to suffer from terrible survivor's guilt, because she knew what was going to happen, and she only got herself out of Europe. So she desperately wants to fight against Hitler. And what she does is she kind of catalogs all those secrets that she overheard about weapons, military plans. And as I mentioned, she's always been kind of a secret budding inventor scientist. And she decides that she's going to focus her energies on making torpedoes more effective at sea. She knows that most of the Nazi scientists are focused on this. This is kind of like the gold standard that they're all searching for, because if you can create radio-controlled torpedoes, you can dominate in the battle at sea. Right now, all across the world, torpedoes are incredibly ineffective. So with the help of a fellow inventor, another unlikely suspect, a musician, she creates what she calls the secret communication system, which is a series of small devices that she puts on torpedo overhead, a ship, and then on the torpedo itself, so that the torpedo can be radio controlled at sea by constantly simultaneously switching radio frequencies. The sort of problem up until this point about creating radio controlled torpedoes is that the signal sent could be intercepted, jammed, or redirected. And she patents this invention. And I don't know how much you guys know about the patent process, but it's really hard to get a patent. And in fact, her patent process is brought to the attention of the United States government, and they see the potential in her patent. They flag it, and Hetty offers her patent to the Navy for their use in the war effort. But of course, a beautiful woman could not possibly know anything about weapons design, so the Navy refuses to use her design. And instead, they send her off on a USO war bond raising tour, where she sings and dances and raises more money than any other actor or actress for the war effort. And she assumes that her invention, which she had really poured her whole self into, the death knell has rung for it, but she's wrong. In the years after the war, her patent, when it expires, is taken by the Navy and other military factions and private entities who are contracted out by the military, and they use that patent in multiple iterations to create inventions, first for military use, and then ultimately for Wi-Fi. So every day we are holding, whether it's by your cell phone or on your Zoom or your computer, we're holding in our hands a device that Hedy Lamarr ultimately sparked. And in many ways, it's the farthest reaching invention and reminder of her life, the most important one, certainly. And as I was putting together this story, it seemed to me that Hetty, her history, this invention, is really almost like it's really an emblem, like, or a metaphor for what's happening to all women. The manner in which her contribution to this world-changing device was lost or ignored for decades really reflects the marginalization of a lot of historical women's contributions. And that problem is both historical and modern. You know, there's still vestiges of that issue lasting in our society today. You know, really in many ways, whether her work in this spread spectrum technology, as it's often referred to, whether it was purposefully disregarded or unconsciously forgotten, that oversight or that intentional exclusion, it was really founded on a historical misconception about women and their capabilities. You know, women historically had been conscripted into these very narrow roles. And so people had very narrow assumptions about women's abilities over time. And that's why, you know, I think why I feel so passionate about what I'm doing, because until we kind of change the lens through which we look at the past and see all the vast contributions made by historical women and see the vast scope of their capabilities, then we're going to continue to view the past more restrictively than it likely was. And then we risk carrying those perspectives over to the present, right? So we need to kind of start to change the way we look at the past so that we can change the way we view our present and our future. I kind of look at it this way. So imagine if Hetty's society had been able to view her not just as this really blindingly beautiful creature, but as a human being with a sharp mind capable of scientific contributions, which we all know she was capable of, then they might have learned that her interior life was far more fruitful and important than her exterior beauty. Her invention might have been accepted by the Navy when she first offered it, right? And what impact might that have had on the war? Maybe if they had adopted her invention when she offered it, the Allies would have been more effective at sea early on. Thousands of lives could have been saved, and World War II could have ended earlier than it did. And if that had happened, then maybe the final solution, that horrible plan for the Jewish people, could have been avoided, right? So many thousands of lives could have been saved, which was really one of Hetty's primary goals. And in that way, the only woman in the room really becomes a cautionary tale about the danger in underestimating women and their abilities. So, you know, my goal is to really offer this different lens, a fresh lens for us to examine our past so that we can then carry over that perspective into the present and then into the future as well. So that's kind of my little spiel on kind of how I do what I do, why I do it, and also just sort of an overarching perspective on the only woman in the room. And I'd love to take any questions or answer any ideas any of you have about it.
Great, thank you. That was really helpful, and I do think most of our audience has read the book, but it's
that's
still
wonderful.
I think what you highlight there is just such of critical importance, not only just for our small community, but, you know, globally, like, you know, how we look at women. And, you know, one question when you were speaking that came to my mind was just about, you know, are the history books ever going to be rewritten? or we're going to be relying on authors like you to uncover and give the stories behind so many of these prominent inventions and life-changing, you know.
I mean, my ultimate goal obviously would be to have the curriculum in schools be totally overwritten to actually include women. And I do see, you know, and my children are in middle school and late elementary school, I do see their teachers start to include different perspectives. My son, for example, was, they did a whole unit on the immigrant experience, and they shared perspectives of women who worked in factories. But those things are really, those were decisions made by the instructor. They're not things that are part of a textbook or part of a fixed curriculum. It really requires more open-minded instructors and teachers to find that material and bring it into the classrooms. Some of my books have been used in certain classrooms, but I think we need, and that's great, I'm happy for that, but we need, you're right, to really start it from the ground up and really look really carefully at the curriculum and the textbooks and the materials that are being used in classrooms to ensure that not just the predominant white male voices are being included, but the voices of women and people of color, all of those perspectives. Because history isn't just one person's experience. It's all of our collective experiences brought together. So yeah, I hope so, because otherwise I'm going to be doing this for a really, really long time, which is fine. But yeah, I'd love there to be change from within.
All right, Phoebe's got a question.
So more relating to LiveGirl itself, like LiveGirl's mission is to empower and equip both middle school and high school girls to become confident leaders. Right. And so my question is, what would you give your high school or middle school self? What advice would you give her? And what advice would you give to girls today?
Oh, it's a great question. Gosh, I mean, my story and sort of how where I started, and then how I kind of got off track and had to circle back. I would tell my middle school self, that girl that read the Mists of Avalon and found that passion and that calling really right at that moment, to stay with it, to not let those other voices, the voices of society at large, friends, family members, to not let those people deter me from a path that I know inside is the right one for me. I mean, most of the people who gave me the advice, what does a history major do? A history major should go to law school. They were well-intentioned, right? But you alone know what you're meant to do. And I would go back and tell that middle school girl, that young high school girl, to stick to it, not to let those other voices sway me to a different perspective and a different path. And that's what I always tell girls or young women when I give talks is, make sure that you nurture that spark. Make sure if you're lucky enough to find that spark, to find something that you feel absolutely passionate and excited about. Not everybody has that experience, right? If you're lucky enough to have that experience and find that thing, nurture it. Keep an eye on it. That doesn't mean you can't explore other things and try out other things, but don't forget what that one thing is, because that's very often your core authentic self speaking to you before the societal voices around you can get in there and kind of chip away at that core authentic self. So that would be the advice I would have definitely wanted somebody to share with me when I was, probably like an 8th grade girl, 7th, 8th grade girl.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So speaking of voices, so one of my really, big questions had to do with Hetty's relationship with her mother.
Yeah.
And when you think about
parent-daughter here.
Parent-daughter. So we'll start with that. But it seems that one, she was overly concerned with Hetty being spoiled. Yeah. And two, just taking from a line from the book, she said this is Hetty's mom to Mr. Mondle, "You'll spoil the girl, Mr. Mondle." The phrase was not the affectionate admonition it seemed on the surface. It reflected her feelings that I didn't deserve spoiling, that I had already been given too much, that I was at my core unworthy.
Yeah.
So, in terms of voices in your head, I mean, that's a strong one coming from Hetty, and her mom is the actual words that she's using to express what she's, saying is love, but it doesn't feel that way to Hetty.
Yeah, I think, that relationship was one I was definitely interested in exploring, because I really, Hetty was an only child, and I really felt like she was torn in many ways between these two parents, each of which, and I mean, historically, that is accurate. Historically, she had a very fraught relationship with her mother. By all accounts, even when she kind of rescued her mother and brought her to the United States, that didn't really change. Her mother was withholding of affection. and judgmental of Hedy. On the other side, you had, by all accounts, a very warm, nurturing relationship that she had with her father. And in some ways, I sort of thought that Hedy was, those parents and that relationship was emblematic of sort of our relationship with society and our relationship with those different voices that we hear in our heads. You're not worthy. You need to toe the line. You've already been given enough. You should be thankful for what you have. Don't put yourself out there. Keep in that box. And so in my mind, Hedy's situation was was a familiar one, I think, for so many girls and women in terms of the sort of voices and experiences that they're having. You know, on one side, women are really being told, you should be grateful for what you have. You should be thankful. Don't reach too far. This is what a successful woman looks like. Here's the box we want you to fit yourself into. And then on the other side, if you're lucky enough to have somebody in your life or have an organization that lets you say, you know what, you don't have to go into anybody's box. You can create your own box. And that's really what Hedy's father was for her, was that voice saying, you know, let's take a walk in the park and talk about how things are made, or you can do whatever you want. You can be an actress. Yeah, would I prefer you find a nice man and marry and live down the street? Sure, that feels safe to me, but that isn't who you are. And so in many ways, I wanted, even though it is an accurate representation of the relationship she had with our parents, I also think it's a relationship that all of us have with societal voices, and we have a choice, right? We have a choice to say, I'm going to put myself in that box to fulfill other people's expectations and other people's definition of happiness, or I'm going to create my own box, and then that's reflective of my own struggle to stay on the path of being a lawyer, which was very societally reinforced, very financially remunerative, or to pursue something that was more authentic for me, which wasn't as well applauded by everyone in the world.
Thank you. So we're going to go to some of the listener questions right now, and I'll just read them. This is from Sherry West, our LiveGirl founder. I was so inspired by the only woman in the room. Thank you for telling Hedy Lamarr's story. Has Hedy received official recognition for her inventions? And what was your research process like? Were you able to talk with any living family members?
Right. So for a long, long time, people had no idea about Hedy and the work that she did. And then his name's going to escape me right now. I apologize. I've written 5 books since I wrote this one. There was a man in the 1980s. I think he was like a military engineer. And he came across in doing work on some of these, this is the 1990s, excuse me, and he was doing work kind of that was a derivation of her work. And he found he kind of traced down the core of the work, and he found Hedy Lamarr. And over the next several years into the early 2000s, he kind of traced her work, traced her involvement, and realized what a profound impact she had had on this technology. And he actually assembled all that work and the proof for it, and he nominated her for a science award, which she did win. And she was still alive when this happened. I think she died maybe in 2008 or 10. I'd have to go back and look. She lived a very long life. And she was aware, which is a beautiful thing, during her lifetime, that somebody out there, some larger institutions, acknowledged the work that she did, because in her own mind, that was her most important contribution. There's a wonderful documentary. I don't know if anyone has seen it. It's called Bombshell. Mm-hmm. I think it's still on Netflix. Oh, you have seen it. Okay. It's great. It's a really good companion, I think, for my book, because it does mostly focus on her invention and then how people afterwards kind of found it. But there's some interviews of her that were taped before she died that are played aloud in the documentary. And she talks about about how she would have rather been known for her inventions than for her acting. So I think for her, that was incredibly important. In terms of my research, mm-hmm. And then whether I've met any of her families, which are really 2 different questions. My research differs from character to character, person to person, era to era, but there is a sort of core process that I use in terms of the research. Once I've decided that I'm going to focus in on a particular woman, I look everywhere for original source material about them. For those of you who aren't familiar with that phrase, that means something by my person, my character, my woman's own hand, written by them or about them during the time period that they were living. So that would be letters to and from them, journals, schedules, photographs, things like that. That's where I always start. And that's what really helps inform the creation of the character, their voice, the things they think about, the way they talk, their relationships that they have with other people. Once I've exhausted that, and how much you have of that really varies from woman to woman. Don't forget, always in this research, it's only recently that women's stories, women's narratives, were considered worthy of keeping and telling. So very often when you're looking for original source material, you're not going to find it. So just take as one example, my most recent book, which is Lady Clementine. It came out in January. That's about Winston Churchill's wife, Clementine, who was hugely important. She did so much that nobody knows about. There are so many books about Winston Churchill that there's an entire bookstore in New York City that's just about Winston Churchill. But when you go to find material about his wife, it's much more limited. There are some letters, there's maybe 2 biographies, there's stuff related to him that I can kind of plug her into, but that just gives you an example. Here's a woman who was at his side doing a vast amount of the stuff we actually attribute to him, and evidence of that is scant. So that just kind of gives you a sense of how hard it is sometimes to get original source material. Once I've exhausted the original source material, I'll cast my net much wider to find whatever I can from a macro or micro perspective about my character and the world that they inhabit. That from a macro perspective, that can include military developments, social developments, political developments, cultural norms, to a micro world, how they dressed, what they wore, what their architecture was like, what kind of food they were eating. Because you need to know all of those things, not only to create a very realistic, accurate world for your character to inhabit, but also to see the things that are influencing them during the course of their lives. Things that we might not even be aware of from our distance, from our vantage point in the future. So that kind of is the nature of the research. I'll create a timeline, I'll create places for the original source stuff to kind of plug in, and then I'll fill that in, and then I start writing. In terms of whether I actually have met any of Hedy's children, I didn't actually contact them when I was doing the research. First of all, I don't write biographies, I write fiction. But secondly, they weren't even part of the story. They weren't alive during her lifetime. They're off stage, right? So anything that they would really know about her is going to be very much secondhand. It's not going to be original source material. If they had written, like in the case of Winston Churchill, one of their daughters, she passed away before I wrote the book, but she had written a biography, she had assembled letters, she was alive and participated in a lot of the events that took place in the story. She would have been a really interesting person to talk to. But Hedy's too, she adopted one child, which I can talk about, which is kind of crazy. And then she had 2 biological children after the story happened. Mm-hmm. So, but I do know that they've read it. And I do know that I've heard through people that know them, that they were really happy to see that celebration of their mother's life, even though it's fictional, of course, to see that the positive, really positive impact that she had on our world has been noticed and kind of celebrated and discussed.
Awesome, thank you. So another question from our viewers, who are some of your favorite current day female role models?
Oh my gosh, there's like a million. How can I even pick out a couple? There's so many. I mean, today, without getting too political, there's a lot of women who are doing really important political stuff, getting their voices out there. And that's across the spectrum. That's whether you're conservative or liberal or somewhere in between. I think that's super important. And I love that there are younger voices out there, like Greta, I can't pronounce her last name, the environmental activist. I mean, I think it's wonderful that that younger women are starting to feel empowered and know that their voices can be heard and can effectuate change. I think that's super, super critical. But there are a million women behind the scenes who, just take what we're going through today, with the coronavirus crisis. There are so many doctors, nurses, healthcare providers, on the front lines, making sure that people are cared for and their stories aren't known, you know, and those are stories that deserve to be told as well. But I hope that, you know, through what I'm doing, that we can start to see that women have been and are everywhere, and have been and are making enormous impacts, and have been and have enormous capabilities. So, you know, I hope that we can shift the lens and kind of look at what they're doing.
Great, thank you. Another question we have is, doing some additional research, I see that Hetty was married 6 different times. Why do you think this was?
Oh my, well, there's a reason I stop her story when I do. You know, the story kind of stops still in World War II. We're still kind of dealing with her contributions that she did through the USO and raising money for the war. It's not like a super happy, uplifting ending, but it's, I think, in many ways, the critical juncture of her life. I believe that, and this is just my own supposition that I kind of worked into the fictional Hedy Lamarr that I created. I really think that, you know, getting back to this question of our societal perception of us and societal expectations and our authentic selves, right, and the kind of collision between these two and the tension. I really believe that Hetty's authentic self wasn't this glamorous woman of the screen. I think her true self was really the quiet, puttering inventor. I think that's really who she was and what she valued in herself. And I think she, that invention, her secret communication system that she used that she created and patented for the war, I think that was the expression of her most authentic self. And I think when that invention was rejected, it was like her authentic self was marginalized and rejected. And I think from that point going forward in a lot of her life, I really think that she started bit by bit to buy into the societal assessment of who she was and what was important about her appearance, her impact on men, her control over men. And I think more and more as the years went on, that sort of superimposed and overtook her more authentic scientist self. And I think in part that played out in her relationships over time. You know, she wasn't ever herself when she went into these relationships. She was a construct. She was a social construct. And there was no real intimacy in those relationships. And I really think that in many ways, her sort of downfall, her downward emotional social spiral happened with the rejection of this particular invention. She struggled with addiction in the decades that followed. It was very common in the movie studios in this time to actually, they had a doctor on site who would give their stars drugs to keep them going, keep them thin. And she was addicted to a lot of those medications as well, which wasn't considered an addiction. It was considered treatment at that time. And I think that also kind of played into the sort of downward spiral of her life. If that makes sense.
I'm sorry. Did you think about at all the relationship with Fritz, potentially how it may have impacted her decisions to, you know, marry, divorce multiple times? You know, it seemed by today's standards, I read it as that he was quite emotionally abusive, potentially physically abusive. There were definitely hints of that in the book. What were your thoughts on that?
I think, you know, I think in some ways her relationship with him was, I mean, it started from a place of inauthenticity, right? You know, her parents kind of pushed her a little bit. She was kind of dazzled by the exterior world that he inhabited, their multiple homes. I don't think there was ever a real emotional connection between them. But I do think that the abuse, a lot of verbal abuse, definitely some physical abuse, I think made her very guarded in her relationships. But I also think in part, she was always seeking her father in her relationships. And not to be too Freudian about it, but she had this wonderful, close, accepting relationship with her father that was in many ways very unique for that time period. And I don't think there were a lot of men who were actually like that. You know, I think she was kind of looking to recreate that sense of security and full acceptance that she felt with her father. And I don't think that was, first of all, I don't think she was looking in the right place for those kind of relationships. But also, I don't think she was presenting her real self in those relationships. She was entering into those relationships as the glamorous movie star Hedy Lamarr, not as this sort of quiet, puttering scientist person that I really think she actually was inside. Mm-hmm. And that I think that I think it was never possible for her to have authentic relationships in any of those marriages. And then, of course, she had, addiction issues and parenting issues. She was not a good mother, and and that again is all part and parcel of this.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Another question from our viewers is, who will you write about next? I vote for Grace Hopper or Cecilia Payne.
Ooh, I like that. I'm going to put them on my list. So I actually have 3 books already done that are coming out in the next 2 years. The one that's already out after this one is Lady Clementine, which I talked about already, about Clementine Churchill, who was unbelievable. I mean, she was not the woman behind the man. She was the woman beside the man, in front of the man, shouldering the mantle of political leadership with Winston Churchill from World War I all the way through World War II. She was really incredible. The book that comes out actually this summer, I have a story coming out on Audible. I don't know if any of you are Audible listeners. It's called Agent 355. It's about a Revolutionary War spy who was a woman. And she was unbelievable. I actually do not believe that we would have necessarily won the Revolutionary War if it weren't for the espionage that she engaged in. She actually, she was a young woman. She was only 18. She's real. We don't know her identity, but I kind of came up with who I think she was. And she was 20, excuse me. She actually was the one who foiled Benedict Arnold's plot to deliver West Point to the British. And if she had not gotten that information and, really exploited that plot, it's possible that we would have lost the Revolutionary War. So she's incredibly important and really not very well explored or celebrated. Next January, I have a book coming out about Agatha Christie. You may know her as the famous mystery novelist, most successful, prolific author of all time. But she actually, when she was a relatively young woman in her early 30s, when she just started out on her career, she disappeared herself for 11 days in circumstances very like one of her novels. Her disappearance, her car was found running on the edge of a cliff. Her belongings were everywhere. It prompted the largest manhunt in England's history. And then she just as mysteriously reappeared on the 11th day, and no one knows what happened to her during that time period. And the book is really an exploration of who she, like all my stories, how she became the person that she was, the sort of breadth of her contributions, but also the way in which those 11 days were really the pivotal event in her life and how they allowed her to rewrite herself back into the historical narrative in a way that is very unusual for a woman of her time. And then next June of 2021, I have a book coming out called The Personal Librarian. You all are familiar probably with J.P. Morgan, the famous financier and industrialist from the late 1800s, early 1900s. He has an incredible museum in New York City. Some of you have maybe seen it. It's called the Morgan Library. It has the world's best collection of medieval manuscripts. When he created that building in the early 1900s, he hired a woman to be its librarian and curator. Her name was Belle DaCosta Green. And she was only able to become this powerful force in the art world for the many decades that followed because she hid her real identity. She was actually African American and she passed as white. And this was the age of segregation. And her father was actually one of the most prominent African American civil rights advocates in the years after the Civil War. He was the first African American man to go to Harvard, and he was also the dean of Howard Law School. And it was one of the founders of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which, if it had not been overturned in the late 1890s, would have guaranteed equality for all people from the Civil War onward. But because his efforts failed, his own daughter, and segregation became the law of the land, his own daughter had to hide her identity in order to become this powerful force in the art world. So it's really, she was an amazing woman, had huge contributions and reach, but it's also a really interesting look at a really often overlooked time period in our history, a time period which has really formed the core of a lot of the racial problems that we have in our country today, and in many ways parallels are a lot of the issues that we're facing today. So those are coming up, and then after that, I have 2 more books. If you want to hear about those, I'm happy to tell you.
But we might have one more question. I think Phoebe has one more.
So one of my favorite parts of the book was when Hetty was in Hollywood and she just got there and she's negotiating her salary.
Oh.
And originally she was offered $125, and then after negotiating, she gets it up to $550, which is a huge increase. Yeah,
huge.
A week. And so I thought that part was really interesting because she seems just so ahead of her time, and negotiating salaries today is something that people and women struggle with. So I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Oh yeah, I mean, she was ahead of her time. And I don't spend a lot of time in her Hollywood world. that's the setting for part of it, but it's not really the focal point of the book. But there are so many things in her in her years as an actress which really show her prowess and her her advanced perspective. One of them was that contract negotiation, which was incredible because she had no bargaining power. I mean, she wasn't a star, but what she always had was, at least on the surface, maybe not inside, she always had a strong faith in her ability to be firm and to the force of her will. And that evidenced itself time and time again. I mean, I'm sure you noticed in the book, there's several Me Too type of situations where things can go. And, I wrote those before the Harvey Weinstein scandal.
I was going to ask you about that.
before. And as I was editing it in like November, I was looking at those scenes and I could not believe it was like the stuff I had written was stuff that was still happening today. And I don't believe she ever succumbed to that. I think she had a really strong, not that she was a prude or a purist or anything. I just think she wasn't going to let other people take advantage of her. And I do think part of that stems from her years as Fritz Mandel's wife. She didn't want to go through that again. And what we don't get into, but which does happen kind of off the pages, off the time period of the book, she becomes one of the very first women producers.
Yes.
She also did all sorts of interesting things in terms of her contract negotiations, her rights, her salaries, her percentages of movies, her ability to actually do work outside the scope of her contract that was very forward thinking for her time. I mean, she was such a unique person. And such a strong person. Unfortunately, those latter years of her life, kind of get lost in sort of the gossipy drama and the many marriages. But there's so many really interesting things she's doing as a powerful woman in Hollywood at such a very early time. So that I think that's incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. There's one other question. I also have the same question. Do you have any book recommendations, or what are you reading right now?
Oh my gosh, I have a huge stack right now. Right now, I'm finishing up Margaret Atwood's The Testaments, which is the last book in her Handmaid's Tale series.
Yep.
If anyone's familiar with that, it's an incredible book. She's a huge favorite of mine. I think she explores a lot of the issues I'm interested in. Women in their roles, how history is formed, giving us a fresh lens through all of her work. So almost anything that she has written is so, I think, important really to read and so timely. That I'm finishing up right now. Gosh, what else do I have in my stack? I have a whole bunch of books that I'm doing blurbs for, terrific books by a lot of history writers, Erica Roebuck, Gillian Cantor, who are writing books about women, taking women from the past, real women, and really celebrating their stories. Greer McAllister. And then also in my stack, what do I have? I just put it together right now. I have the new Emily St. John Mandel book. She wrote Station 11, which I would not recommend reading right now. It's a little too close to home. It's about a pandemic. And then I also, what am I reading? Oh gosh, I just finished Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Water Dancer, which is a wonderful book and is a really interesting take on Harriet Tubman. The obviously incredible woman from the 1800s who really formed, along with Frederick Douglass, the Underground Railroad and liberated so many slaves and really has such an enormous impact on so many people. I'd recommend that one as well. So, my gosh, I can send you a million books if you want historical women. So,
Oh, thank you. That was really helpful. I definitely took note of some of those. So on behalf of LiveGirl, I wanted to thank you, Marie, for celebrating Women's History Month with us. LiveGirl will be hosting an April book club for middle school grades 5 through 8. I'm just going to let our audience know about that. So the featured book is called Disaster Days by Rebecca Behrens. It's about a girl who's babysitting 2 kids on an island near Seattle when an earthquake strikes and how she handles the situation. Yeah, and that takes.
Well, I would just like to say thank you so much for having me. I love what your organization is doing, and it's such a great opportunity to talk with you and all your folks. And thank you for celebrating Women's History Month. It's so important. In the meantime, everyone stay safe and healthy.
Yeah, you too. And we really appreciate you taking time out to Zoom with us. I mean, it's really exciting to have the author with us live and be able to ask you questions in real time. So we appreciate that. And also to you and your family, stay healthy and stay safe.
Yeah, really. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Okay,
Bye.
take care. Bye. Thanks.